Welcome to this session titled What's New? Going Open Source with the new GitHub repository for Business Central. My name is Maria Железова, and with me today here is Alexander Haustrup.
Maria and I work on the team that are working on taking the Business Central application open source, and this session here is going to talk about how we did that for the system application with the repository called BCApps. Today's session, we're going to start out by talking who this session is for, and then we'll introduce the BCApps repository. We'll give an overview of what's in there, and then we'll go over some of the automation that we have set up in the BCApps repository. And finally, we'll go through an end-to-end process of how you, as a member of the BC community, can make a contribution into the BCApps repository from idea all the way to a merge pull request.
Thank you, Alex. Now let's get started. First, let's cover who this session is for. First and foremost, we are looking for people with somewhat technical experience in developing applications for Business Central. We also want people who are curious about how Microsoft moves closer to collaborations with partners. We want people who are willing to contribute source code to unblock their own solutions, or they want to they're tired of doing repetitive work and want to fix it once and for all in the product itself. Now let's take a look at a brief introduction to BCApps. It's a repository hosted on GitHub, and it was actually launched officially in November 2023, just before Directions EMEA. Since then, we have built version 24.0 in close collaborations with the community. It has been forked a lot of times. We have nearly like 200 stars, a lot of contributors, nearly 400 merge pull requests, and 27 of these pull requests were actually made by the community, and we're happy to announce that actually 21 made it with version 24.0 of Business Central. With that, we want to express our gratitude and a big thank you to all the contributors. Now let's take a look at the repository itself for the newcomers, for hopefully the new contributors that we're going to have going forward. This is what you're going to see on the front page when you go to AKMS BCApps. I want to emphasize here that this repository only hosts the source code for applications developed by Microsoft, such as System Application, Business Foundation, and some of the developer tools, such as Test Runner, Performance Toolkit, and many others. We use AO Go for GitHub, which is another product that Microsoft is developing as a backbone for DevOps. This is how we run the builds and test the apps, etc. And the last thing I want to emphasize here is that this is not the place to report product defects with any customer impact. There are like other channels to do that, so please don't use the repository. Now here you can see the rest of the page that you're going to see when you go to AKMS BCApps. Here in the center, you can see and browse the source code and try to see how it's organized. On the right side, there is a link to the reference documentations where you can read the reference documentations for the code that is right here on the main branch. Up in the Issues tabs, you can see what work is being planned by the community. This is going to be some work that the community wants to address in this repository. And possibly the most important part is the pull requests tab, where you can go and see what is currently being worked on, actively worked on. This is where both Microsoft developers and community developers, they collaborate each other, they co-develop. You can go and browse pull requests, leave comments. We already received feedback that this feedback is actually quite valuable for our developers. And one thing you would actually notice that I want to mention here is that we run several automation pull requests. These are pull requests tagged with the automation tag, and you don't really need to do anything about them. I just want to briefly cover them so that you're aware what automations we actually run in the BCApps repository. First and foremost, we have an automation that updates the BC artifact version in our AO Go settings. This is because our pull request builds and CI/CD builds, they run against a concrete BC artifact version. That is mainly due to the fact that we want to rerun the same builds with the same configurations, and we want to ensure the development cycle is not broken. The next two automations combined is automation that updates the app baselines version and the translation package versions. The former updates the package version for the app baselines, and we use these baselines to compile the apps and to ensure no new breaking changes are introduced. The second automation is to update the translation package versions, and we do that mainly to ensure that translations and apps are compatible. Now, if you're already curious how you can build your own pull request, Alexander here is going to walk you through the process.
Thank you, Maria. So in this next session of the presentation, I'll talk about the contribution process for you as a contributor out there in the BC community. And I'll go through an end-to-end process of how you can go from an idea or a bug that you've discovered in the product to actually merging your pull request and making it into the product. So to get started with contributing to the BCApps repository, the first thing you'll need is just an idea or a bug. So an idea could be something you find on the BC Ideas page. It could also be an idea that you've submitted yourself to the BC Ideas page. Or you can find a bug in the product. Ideally not something with customer impact, because as Maria already mentioned, that's something we should expedite. But if you have something that just is mildly annoying to you and you want to have a way of fixing it, by all means, continue with a contribution. The second step in this process is that you need to create an issue on GitHub. If you go under the Issues tab, you should be able to see these options, and you want to select one of the top two ones. So either you want to implement a BC idea, or you want to fix a bug. When you click Get Started, it will take you to a form they need to fill out. It's just to give us some information of what it is you want to do. Once you open up an issue, this is really the place where you can collaborate with the BC community and members of the Microsoft team in order to figure out what it is you want to implement. Maybe there are some clarifying questions that need to be asked. The thing to look out for is here on the right side, you will get an approve label. And the approve label basically means that you've gotten the go-ahead from Microsoft to continue with this contribution. We support you in the contribution, and we're looking forward to seeing your pull request. So once you have the approve label, then you can go ahead and start developing, basically. And to start developing, probably the easiest way to do that is just by creating a fork of the BCApps repository. On the GitHub page, it's relatively simple. Just click on the fork icon, and then you're off. The second step is to then set up your dev environment. This is a bit up to you how you set it up, but we've documented how to do this with BC Container Helper and Docker. We essentially have a script that you can run, type in the right parameters, and you're off. You have a local Docker environment where you can publish your apps to, and you can test. You can test it manually. You can write test cases, run those tests. However you develop, you can do that in these containers. Next step here, as I mentioned, time to develop. This is when you get to develop your bug fix or your idea, or write the tests, test it manually, get a coworker to test it with you, however you normally develop. Once you're happy with what you have, then it's time to open up a pull request. Now, opening up a pull request, again, is done through the GitHub UI, and all you need to provide is a title, a good description of what it is that you're trying to do. If you have GitHub Copilot, this is very easy because you can just get Copilot to do it for you. And then the last step here is to link your pull request to your approved GitHub issue. Now, the way you do that is just by writing a hashtag and then the number of your issue. So if you go under the issues page in GitHub, it should say a number like 123. So just write hashtag 123 if that's your issue number. Once you open up your pull request, we have some automation that starts kicking off right away. This is also when members of the BC community and engineers at Microsoft will take a look at your PR, write some comments, ask some questions about what it is you're doing. But if you scroll down to the bottom of your PR, you'll see a summary that GitHub gives you. Now, in this summary, in the top here, this section is really focused on the code review aspect of what we require to merge your PR. So in this case here, Jesper is requesting me to make some changes. I can see I don't have quite the approvals yet. There's still some comments I need to resolve. In the bottom part here, that's where we report the automated checks. So we have checks for checking for work items and the pull request build and so on. So I think it's worthwhile to go through each of one of these one by one to see what it is that's required to merge a PR into the BCApps repository. So starting off with comments, the first thing we require is that all comments are resolved. As I said, when you open up your pull request, you'll get comments from us in Microsoft or other members of the BC community. And comments could be as simple as just committing a suggestion, or it could be something like a discussion item that you need to resolve with the reviewer. The important thing here is that all these conversations are resolved before the PR can be merged. The second step here is that you need approvals. We require at least 2 approvals from maintainers of the BCApps repository, which essentially means 2 approvals from engineers at Microsoft. As for automated checks, we check for linked work items. So as I mentioned earlier, it's important when you open up your pull request that you link to an approved issue. And that's because we have a check on the pull request that looks for links to issues. And if you don't have a link to an issue, or if the issue that you're linking to is not approved, then you'll get a comment in your PR explaining what the next steps are. Luckily, it's very easy to resolve. Once you have your approved issue, you can just write hashtag and then your issue ID, and the comment goes away, and this check becomes green. The next check is called for Microsoft validate link to internal work items. Now, there are no action items for you here as a contributor. This is a reminder to us in Microsoft that there's some internal accounting we need to do. For example, if your change needs to be reflected in the release notes, then this is a reminder for us to do that. But there's no action for you as a contributor. The last and probably more significant of these checks is the pull request build. Now here we actually take what you've built and we try to compile that and test that in our gates. And the requirement here is that everything compiles, all code cop rules are satisfied, and that tests are passing. If you open up a pull request build, it'll look a little bit like this. There's a lot going on here, many green checks here. This is an example of a successful one. Unfortunately, GitHub doesn't do a great job at displaying this, so I'll try to represent it a bit of a different way, in that our pull request build essentially consists of two phases, a build phase and a test phase. In the build phase, we build the system application, the business foundation, the test framework, and so on. All the apps essentially in the repository. And we build those apps in 3 different flavors. We build it in the vanilla mode, which is just compiling the app as it is. Then we build it with translations as well. And then we build it in clean mode. Now, clean mode means that we apply these preprocessor tags that we use. Our preprocessor tags are clean. For example, here we have clean 23. And it just means that this snippet of code here will not be included in the clean build, but would be included in the other builds. So there's just a bit of a difference between our different build modes. Now, more often than not, you'll see if one of them fails, then all of them fails. But there are cases where only the clean build would fail and the normal vanilla build of the system application would not. So that's just something to keep in mind. In the second phase, we start testing. And we test the system application and the business foundation both in the vanilla mode, but also in clean mode. If everything goes well, everything compiles, all tests pass, you'll see your pull request build looking like this. But that's not always the case. And sometimes things are failing. And to discuss what you need to do when things are failing, I'll go through a short demo of an example of where something is failing and how you can fix that. So here I have a pull request, and just to explain the pull request really quickly, it changes the headlines implementation to just the first time a user logs in, it displays a different message. So in this case, it displays "Welcome to Business Central" the first time you log in. Now I open up this pull request, I provided a summary, and I linked to my issue. When I scroll down, I can see that some checks are not successful. So I have 5 failing checks. So when I scroll through the list, I see this for Microsoft check that's failing. As I mentioned, there's no action item for you, so just feel free to ignore it. But if I scroll further down, I see that building the system application fails, and it fails both in default, clean, and translated mode. So now I know that there's something I need to do. Now, because it fails in the build phase, one trick that you can use is just to go up to the Files tab here. And not only can you see my changes, but GitHub actually also reports what the compilation issues are. So in this case, it says here that I haven't given an argument that corresponds to the required formal parameter user security ID in isFirstLogin. So here, I'm calling a function called isFirstLogin, but I didn't give any GUID as an input. And I was supposed to do that. So I made a mistake here, and that caused a compilation issue. So that's an example of how you can debug a compilation issue in your PR. Now to fix that, you can either do it in VS Code, or you can go up here and click Edit File, however you prefer to do it. Now, let's say I fixed that. So I have another PR here where I fixed that compilation issue. I go under Files Changed, and under Files Changed, I see that I now pass an input to this function that is of GUID type, And now GitHub is not complaining about any compilation issues anymore. So if I scroll back up again and I go back out into the conversation tab, scroll down, I still have 4 failing checks. So if I scroll through the list, I see building the system application in default clean and translated mode. That now succeeds. But when I scroll past that, I see that building the system application tests is failing. So let's take a deeper look at that. If we go under the details tab, there are 2 ways you can kind of figure out what's going wrong here. But probably the easiest way is to go under summary. And when you scroll through the summary, you see it a couple places. Here, for example, we can see we have some test function here that failed. It expected one message but got another. If you scroll past that and all the way down to the bottom, ALGO actually provides a really nice summary of all the tests that we're running and which ones are failing. So here, for example, the business foundation tests are all succeeding. That's great. But when we scroll past that, we see that the system application tests are mostly succeeding, but one of them failed. So the way you can debug that and figure out what's going on is just to expand this section here. And now we can see that it's a headline test that failed. Is this particular test case called test get user greeting. And we can also see the stack trace. So this is when you as a developer can use that information to then either fix your test or fix the implementation. Once you fix that, hopefully the checks become green, and once you get the approvals, we're ready to merge. So to wrap up, I've made a short checklist of what it takes to make a contribution into the BCApps repository. First of all, you need that all comments are resolved. You need at least 2 approvers. You need to link your pull request to an issue. And then the pull request build needs to be passing, meaning no compilation issues and no test failures. If you can check off all these boxes, then you can merge your pull request. And you've made a contribution into the BCApps repository. If for whatever reason you can check off most of the boxes, but one of them for some reason you can't, let's say the pull request build is failing and you just can't figure out why, or you think that you've linked your issue, but for some reason GitHub doesn't recognize that you've linked your issue, by all means just ask for help in your pull request. Create a comment in the pull request and a member of our team or someone in the BC community will help you out. As we mentioned earlier, BCApps is truly a community effort. And so there are people looking at this repository every day. And at least our engineers in Microsoft are very familiar with the process of getting a contribution into the BCApps repository. So there'll be people out there to help you out. If you discover a bug in the contribution process, meaning you can't spin up a container for some reason, or you find that our documentation is lacking or is missing some information, by all means, create an issue for us. We have an issue template for that. It's called Report a Bug in the Contribution Process, and we'll take a look as quickly as possible. We want to smoothen out the contribution process as much as we can. So please help us out if you find a bug in the contribution process.
Thank you, Alex, for this lovely demonstration of the contribution process. Now we've prepared several key takeaways from these sessions. And the first and foremost is that co-development is Microsoft's vision of Business Central application. If you haven't gotten the memo yet, this is indeed why we're doing all the GitHub work we do. This is why we are moving to true open source. This is why we're moving our internal development to GitHub. So this is the place where Microsoft developers can indeed co-develop with all the partners we have out there for Business Central. Next, I also want to emphasize that contribution is the same for everyone. All the checks that Alex mentioned earlier, they are the same for both internal developers and for everyone else out there. We require the same number of recurs, the same number of reviewers, the same checks need to pass on every pull request, no matter if it's external or internal. And again, as Alexander mentioned, do not hesitate to ask. We would hate to see you get stuck on something that is might be like an issue on our side, or sometimes it just might be like instability or whatever. Just ask us for help. So if you're eager to start, just go to AKMS BCApps and explore our repository. Here we have compiled a list of other resources that you can check out in order to connect with other members of the community or have more documentation on your site when you are trying to contribute to BCApps. Next, I want to promote a session from our colleagues that is about Business Foundation and the number series modules. And I want to emphasize that Business Foundation was indeed the first application that was developed on GitHub from the beginning. So please check out these sessions to familiarize yourself more about this application. With that, I want to say thank you and see you on GitHub.